The Brian Lair Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, sitting in for Brian today. And now we're going to unpack Mayor Mamdani's first budget since taking office. Yesterday, he and the city council struck a deal hours before the legally mandated deadline for the new fiscal year. The $126 billion budget covers funding for housing vouchers, half-price transit fares, free childcare, parks, libraries, and more. It closes a projected deficit without the deep cuts some feared, and in a late surprise, it keeps the NYPD's headcount flat. Here's how the mayor framed it at yesterday's press conference.
Throughout this process, I've been reminded of the words of the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. If socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. If these past months have shown us anything, it is that socialists not only understand economics just as well as the capitalists who came before, but that we can solve their years of mismanagement through an embrace of our principles. There is nothing fiscally responsible about balancing the budget on the backs of working people.
Joining me now to talk through the details and what it says about the kind of mayor Mamdani is going to be is WNYC's mayoral power reporter Elizabeth Kim, who covers it for the Gothamist and WNYC newsroom. Liz, welcome back. Good to see you, not over in our little corner of the world.
That's right, Bridget. Good morning.
So, you heard the mayor there quoting Hayek, casting himself as the socialist who balanced the books. Before we get into some of the fights in this budget, does the budget back up the boldness of that statement? What did he and the council actually agree to?
Well, I think it's important to take a step back because you know as well as I do that there have been sort of these chapters and mini sagas, right, around this budget, right? Think about, the ask to Albany, like how much money were we going to get for universal child care? Was the governor going to tax the rich? We had all of these dramas that preceded the actual passing of the city budget. So broad strokes, it's $126 billion, and I view the budget as having sort of two hallmark policies. One is from Mamdani, and one is from the council. I would say that the one from the mayor is, as I just mentioned, the introduction of 2K. This is a pilot program which he got money from the state to do, which will be the foundation or jumping off point for that universal child care policy goal, which he promised on the campaign trail. And then the second, I think you can argue, is rental vouchers. Now, this was actually an issue. It had loomed over the budget since the beginning.
This was the sticking point, right?
Exactly. But it was like it predates Mamdani because this was a legal battle between the council and the administration that started under the previous administration under Mayor Eric Adams, right? But you're right. What happened was this ultimately became the sticking point. Now, the result is the city now has a new program for vouchers, and these essentially operate like a local form of Section 8.
So then the concern and the reason that this became the sticking point, Liz, was because the council really wanted to go even further than where they landed for this final budget agreement, right? And that was part of the Mamdani administration's kind of reining back in and, in some ways, not necessarily adopting the sort of Hayek position or I guess not so much the socialist position of extending these vouchers sort of as broadly as the council wanted to.
Exactly. And that was something that was fascinating about these late stage budget negotiations was you saw what kind of seemed like a role reversal between Menin and Mamdani. Mamdani, the Democratic Socialist, is all of a sudden, the mayor trying to exercise fiscal constraint. And then on the flip side, you had Menin, who is viewed as a moderate, who cares about fiscal constraint, all of a sudden arguing for a significant expansion of the city's social safety net, talking about how we needed it to protect vulnerable New Yorkers, how this was about the mayor's central campaign promise of affordability. So that was a very interesting dynamic to see. But that really goes to really the politics of it all, right?
And so what, have you understood so far about what, how they found this middle ground? And, how was it that the mayor had to shift this position from really what he campaigned on, which was to fulfill the promise of city FEPS the way the council had initially adopted it?
Well, I will say that the mood at City Hall, I did not think was celebratory on either side. I mean, it was interesting because you saw Menin and the mayor do their traditional handshake where, they were all smiles. But
so standing in the rotunda of City Hall.
Right. But we all knew that there was a lot of tension behind the scenes. And even at that, traditional handshake presser, and not that, everyone goes well, but there's usually these moments, and you've seen it, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of applause. They will, let's just say the speaker will mention something like fair fares, and there was some of that, but I felt like it was kind of muted. And I think people are still trying to absorb, who really made out better in this situation. Now, like I said, the council, at the late stage of negotiations, they were seeking $300 million a year in additional funding for these types of rental vouchers. What they ended up getting was they're going to get $175 million in the upcoming fiscal year, and the mayor has penciled in $125 million the following year. Now, you do the math. Is that, that's basically $300 million across 2 years, but it's certainly not $300 million annually.
Sure.
And then there is the question of the fact that the city ends up, basically settling the litigation with the council. And I think that is an open question, too. I am yet to read the settlement. It is up. But I think there are questions about, did the council perhaps give up some leverage there by allowing the city to settle this lawsuit? There were many people when this lawsuit first began in the council, and I will say they were in the council, but they believed that they had a very, very strong legal argument that the city needed by law to comply with this law that they passed in 2023. Now, the law that they passed would have even further expanded eligibility beyond this additional $300 million they were asking, right? So I think it's going to be debated. And then, let's not forget the flip side argument is, we had fiscal watchdogs and the mayor himself questioning whether or not this was financially sustainable for the city. The city is in a deep housing crisis right now, which is why we find ourselves in a position where we need to give rental assistance to people so that they can avoid homelessness. The trouble with the vouchers have been, and I'm going back to the original voucher plan, which is known as City FEPS, is the horizon for these vouchers was always originally thought to be 5 years. And there's logic to that, right? We give you a voucher. Of course, you have to go through eligibility every year. But the idea is you have something devastating happen to you. Perhaps you lose a job. Perhaps you get sick. In that 5 years, we're going to help you pay your rent. What's happened, though, is that we're finding that there are people who reach the end of that 5-year mark and they're still unable to afford housing. Perhaps they are working, right? Actually, that is one of the requirements, is a work eligibility requirement under City FEPS, but they still can't afford it. So what has happened is the costs have ballooned because the city has found that even after 5 years, people are still they're basically pleading, I still need these vouchers. And the way that program is set up is they can ask for an extension.
Well, I want to play a clip of how New York City Council Speaker Julie Menin kind of framed this piece of the budget in yesterday's announcement.
In addition to the expansion of FEPS, which is something we fought very hard for, a responsible expansion, at the same time, we are doing a new bill that changes the program in the sense that HPD will be administering the new program. The new program takes it from an entitlement program to one that is subject to appropriations.
Okay, Liz, so let's translate some of that language for our listeners. What does it mean that it's no longer an entitlement and that's now subject to appropriations each year?
So that is a very important distinction, and that is something I think people are mulling over as they evaluate whether or not this was a good deal from the council's perspective, right? Because they're not getting an expansion of what I call those city FEPS vouchers. Those vouchers are entitlements because it basically means that by law, like if you get a voucher, by law, the city has to abide by the rules of that program, and if you're, as long as you're eligible, you'll get it for that 5-year period, and yes, you can ask for an extension. The difference now is and this was part of the negotiations with the mayor, was that they would set up a new program. They would not expand they would not expand city FEPS vouchers, but they would create a new voucher that is administered by a different city agency, and that the funding for that is essentially capped. So the city in the upcoming fiscal year will give it $175 million. That's it, and there's a question, and I asked this yesterday. I'm not sure I got a satisfactory answer, but like, what happens if you're someone who gets one of these new vouchers and then the money runs out? Are you sort of left hanging, left to dry? It's unclear, I think, and I think a lot of these questions still have to be answered as the mayor and the council work to set up this new program.
Sure. Listeners, if you're just joining us, it's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today, and I'm talking with my colleague, Elizabeth Kim, about Mayor Mamdani's first budget, $126 billion. And we invite you to call and text. Mamdani has settled this first budget as mayor. Whether you voted for him or not, is this the mayor you thought you were getting? What in this budget lands for you and what doesn't? We can also take your questions for WNYC and Gothamist reporter Elizabeth Kim. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Liz, I want to talk about the policing element of this budget. But first, Liz, you reported ahead of this budget deal a few weeks back about, how the mayor had somewhat surprisingly agreed to an expansion of the police department, another 580 officers. When he was on this show, he explained why he needed them and backed up what Police Commissioner Tisch had said about that new unit in the Bronx. And then, surprise, yesterday, those 580 officers were not included in the final budget deal. So what happened?
Well, I think this was also this was a genuine surprise. We were talking about how the vouchers that had kind of always sort of loomed over the budget. So it wasn't a new issue. But this decision, and I heard Julie Menin, she was on Morning Edition this morning, and she called it, an 11th hour decision. I don't know that it was that, but it certainly felt like it was not expected. I think the question is, and if you listen to the mayor's explanation on it, and he really only gave one because he didn't take many questions yesterday, but the way he explains it is that it seems as if it was driven by dollars and cents. The question, but the other question is there have been his allies who have been critical of him expanding the NYPD. There was a rally just last Thursday where the public advocate Jumaane Williams urged him to cancel this decision. And it was interesting the way the public advocate chose to phrase it. He pointed to the mayor's victories in the primaries where all of the candidates he endorsed won. And he said that he wanted to see the mayor use his, quote, prowess on policy. He said, apply that prowess towards policy, meaning that, you have the political capital. Look at how popular you are. You don't need to do this. all the same, it's unclear to me how much did ideology and how much did that criticism force the mayor to do it, or was it just the fact that he needed to close the budget. He had to make some extra contributions to this rental voucher program. I think there will be more cuts in this budget that we are yet to see. The budget has not been published on the city's website yet. And I think that it would have been politically unpalatable to some of his supporters on the left if he had made cuts in other areas but not made a cut to police.
Yeah. And as you and I both know, and having covered budgets, it's the first day after the budget, you kind of talk the big headlines, but then it's in the days after and oftentimes long, weeks after where you start to find the real impact of some of these changes. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more reporting on what comes out of this first budget. A listener has texted back on the topic of city FEPs. Can we talk about city FEPs on the merits? It's a subsidy for landlords on the backs of everybody. What do you make of that, Liz?
A subsidy for landlords on the backs of everybody. I mean, it's keeping, at the end of the day, it's keeping people housed. And the argument in support of it has always been that the city winds up paying less money if they're assisting people with their rent rather than having to support them in a homeless shelter. Some people have tried to poke holes at that argument. I think that we will see. The evidence will shake out in the years to come as we track, how expensive is the program. But I think another issue that I think the city needs to address is if you're giving someone a voucher, that it's more than just giving them this rental assistance. It's also about giving them the other supports that they need so that they can eventually wean them off of these vouchers. And I think that that's on two ends, right? That's on the city needs to create more affordable housing, right? And I think the city needs to give those who are most vulnerable the assistance they need to access jobs, education, healthcare.
Liz, let's talk about some of the other affordability pieces that were, already in motion, like the free childcare for 2-year-olds that he and Hochul agreed to early on. But there's a brand new one in the budget. Speaker Menin is calling the college savings accounts the largest program of its kind in the country. Every public school kindergartner gets $1,000. Every public school kindergartner? How's that supposed to work? And what can families actually use this money for?
Menin has called this her baby, and it really is. It was a program that she herself started a decade ago when she was the commissioner of the Department of Consumer Protection. And this is a big jump for the program because it is going from $100 in each account to $1,000. One thing I will say, I was saying before that there wasn't really like a celebratory mood on either side. I would say if someone did sort of come out, the winner, at least, in terms of press, I think it would be Menin because she was able to tout a lot of these as personal victories. It was a program like this that she has sort of made her signature program. And it was also something like Fair Fares, which was something that she put in the budget as her priority. There was a lot of quibbling about why she led this fight over rental vouchers because a lot of people pointed out she did not put that up as a priority when she came out with the council's response to the mayor's budget. But, that's part of politics, too. You can also argue that she was responding to the priorities of her members.
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot in here for everybody, a lot of everyday stuff. There's parks, libraries, arts groups. What stood out to you in terms of some of the funding changes or increases?
Well, Bridget, I hesitate to say because, I will say this, what I thought was striking about the vote last night was you had one Democrat.
Yeah.
Bronx Council member Althea Stevens coming out and voting no. But it was also the remarks she made as to why she was voting no. She says that she represents one of the poorest districts in the city. And she has never seen a time where they got so little funding. And she called what she got, quote, crumbs. And then she proceeds to vote no. Speaker Menin was asked about that this morning on Morning Edition. The speaker said that that was not true. She pointed to borough-wide investments that were part of this budget in her borough. She also argued that policies like fair fares and even the new rental voucher program do affect residents in her district. But I really think that says something about what's perhaps coming from this budget and what we need to look out for. I mean, She was not the only one. I mean, she was the only Democrat that voted no. But there are other people who were sort of grumbling about certain cuts they were seeing that they were not happy with.
Yeah, I saw similar comments coming out of, some of the council members in the Rockaways, both Joanne Areola, who's a Republican.
Sylvina Brooks-Powers.
And Sylvina Brooks-Powers.
She said that there was, for the first time, there was no capital investment in Southeast Queens.
Yeah, and there's a lot of concern about a trauma center in Rockaway, which, the peninsula does not have a trauma center. And both she and Areola, were concerned about the lack of funding that went to that. So it sounds to me like part of what we're going to hear are members talking about the types of projects that they seek funding for within their district, maybe not citywide policies or citywide programs, but those types of investments where they hope to, build towards something in their community that maybe didn't get the money that they've received in previous years. It'll be interesting to see who else comes out with some concerns on that front. On the transit issue, it sounds like it was kind of a split decision. Fair Fares, the half-price program, got its biggest expansion yet, but free buses, which was one of Mamdani's, signature campaign planks, didn't make it into this budget. So, can you talk a little bit about, first, the Fair Fares, who's newly eligible?
Oh, so they raised the eligibility from 150% of the federal poverty line to 200%. They do this a lot and it's a thing that the transit advocates really applaud. I will, though, point out, and transit advocates point this out too, is that the uptake for this program is something around 40%. Even though people are eligible, it's hard to get people to sign up. And I think the mayor has talked about that. And, there are different ways of maybe addressing that, just like automatically perhaps making people eligible. The interesting thing about transit is that one of the priorities that the council did lay out in their own budget proposal was this concept of free fares for very poor New Yorkers. And this would be free fares that would apply to both the subway and the buses. And it seemed as if it would be a way to almost reach a compromise with the mayor who wanted to get that free bus pilot, right? Like, he wasn't able to do that. But this would have been a way to tackle it. And there are advocates for the poor that really, really wanted to see that done, but it wasn't done. And I thought that was interesting because it could have been a shared win, another shared win between the mayor and Menin.
Sure. As I mentioned in the beginning, he closed that projected deficit without making, seemingly big austerity cuts. That people were really bracing for. But a lot of this leans on Albany and delaying pension payments. I've seen some critiques come out from some of the more moderate, budget watchdogs calling this a budget that's been balanced through one-shots. What are some of the concerns you're hearing from watchdogs or even the city comptroller's office about how they reached this balanced agreement?
Well, one thing that I did see last night, a reporter pointed it out and tweeted it, and then I looked up, the document and I saw it. the upcoming deficit for, I guess, in the next fiscal year that the mayor will have to balance is again $6 billion, which is approximately the amount that he had to close with this budget. I know that they started out with this $12 billion figure, but that figure was really outdated, and it was exaggerated. It was $6 billion was more the realistic number that he had to close. So he is going to face the same exact challenges next year. And the question is, how does Hochul respond in that moment? She gave him a lot of money and a lot of legislative leeway to do things like delaying payments into the municipal pensions. What happens?
Sure.
Is the tax the rich movement bigger and more organized, next year as well? We'll see.
And you say Hochul, presumably Hochul, but part of the big dynamic is this is an election year for the governor, right?
You're absolutely right. I jumped the gun. Yeah.
I mean, if we were to look at current polling, but we do know that there will be a competitive general election in November between Governor Hochul and current Nassau County Executive Bruce Blakeman as the Republican. In some scenario where the dynamics of the electorate changed radically between now and then, if Mamdani were to be negotiating with, a Blakeman,
right,
certainly the dynamics of the budget could get much more challenging. But also, given that Hochul will not be running for re-election, will she be less inclined to, curry the favor of the mayor because she doesn't necessarily need him in the same way to support her re-election bid that she, likely does need now.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see, what and how he campaigns, if at all, for her going into November. It's something that certainly I'll be watching for between now and then. But we'll keep talking about this, Liz. We can talk about it back at our desks later, but for right now, we'll leave it there. My guest has been Elizabeth Kim, mayoral power reporter for Gothamist and WNYC. Thanks as always, Liz.
Thanks, Bridget.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.